Sometimes a child's cry for help can break through years of silence and shame. In the small town of Millfield, Wyoming, Sheriff Tom Harlan had learned to expect the worst from people, neighbors turned enemies, friends who no longer spoke, and a community that had forgotten how to care for each other. Tom himself was struggling, 6 months after losing his beloved wife Sarah to cancer. One evening, after breaking up yet another argument between townspeople, a little girl appeared beside him. She was maybe 8 years old, with dirt on her face and tears in her eyes. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "please follow me home. My family needs help." When Tom followed her through the dusty streets to the edge of town, he discovered something that would change everything. The abandoned farmhouse she led him to held a secret that had been hidden for too long. What Tom found there would force the entire town to face a truth they had been avoiding. But what could be so terrible that it would leave grown men in tears? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Sheriff Tom Harlan unlocked the door to his office, the same routine he had followed for 25 years. At 53, his weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen enough trouble to know that peace was a fragile thing, requiring constant vigilance and careful tending. The sheriff's office occupied a corner building that had stood since Millfield's founding in 1887, its brick walls bearing witness to generations of lawmen who had tried to keep order in a town that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Behind Tom's desk hung the original town charter, framed in faded oak and signed by hopeful pioneers who had believed that mutual aid and community spirit would sustain them through any hardship. Now, the document served as a bitter reminder of how far Millfield had fallen from those founding ideals. Tom poured himself coffee from the pot that his deputy, Jake Martinez, had started earlier. Jake was 28, earnest and hardworking, still young enough to believe that law enforcement was about protecting and serving rather than simply managing decline. Tom envied that optimism, even as he worked to preserve it against the daily evidence of human disappointment. The Wyoming landscape beyond the office. Windows stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Millfield had been built on cattle ranching and copper mining, sustained by families who had worked the land for 3 and 4 generations. But drought, corporate payouts, and falling commodity prices had slowly strangled the economic life from the community, leaving behind empty storefronts, abandoned houses, and people who had learned to view their neighbors as competitors for dwindling resources. "Morning, Sheriff," Jake called as he entered with a stack of overnight reports. His uniform was still crisp, his badge polished to a mirror shine that contrasted sharply with Tom's worn leather holster and faded shirt. Quiet night mostly. Had to break up another argument at Murphy's Tavern around closing time. Tom nodded, unsurprised. Murphy's was where men went to drink away their failures and argue about whose fault it was that their dreams had died. The Brennan and Walsh boys again, among others. Something about water rights and property lines. Same old grievances, just louder when they've been drinking. The Brennan-Walsh feud had been simmering for 2 years, ever since the drought forced both families to compete for access to the same creek that ran along their shared property line. What had once been a cordial boundary dispute between longtime neighbors had evolved into something uglier, a bitter conflict that divided extended families and turned childhood friends into enemies. Tom walked to the large map of Millfield County. That covered one wall of his office, its surface marked with colored pins indicating ongoing disputes, foreclosure notices, and what the state euphemistically called social service interventions. The pins seemed to multiply each month, creating a constellation of human suffering that no amount of law enforcement could address. Mayor Patricia Wells knocked on the office door before entering without waiting for permission, a habit that irritated Tom, but which he tolerated out of respect for her position and genuine concern for the community. Patricia was 62, a former schoolteacher who had been elected on promises to bring economic development and restore civic pride to Millfield. 3 years into her term, both goals seemed as distant as ever. "Tom, we need to discuss the situation." "With Frank Morrison's store," Patricia said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the weariness of someone carrying too many unsolvable problems. "He's threatening to close permanently if the town can't help with his property taxes." Frank Morrison's general store had anchored Main Street for 40 years, serving as both commercial center and community gathering place. His father had opened the business in 1952, building it into the kind of establishment where 3 generations of families had shopped for everything from work boots to wedding gifts. Now Frank was 70. His children had moved to cities with better opportunities, and his customer base was shrinking along with their disposable income. "Frank's been carrying half the town on credit for 2 years, Tom observed. "Between the families who can't pay and the ones who've moved away, I'm surprised he's lasted this long." "That's exactly the problem," Patricia replied. "Frank's too generous for his own good, and too proud to admit when people are taking advantage of his kindness. But if we lose the store, we lose the last gathering place that brings people together." Dr. Marcus Henderson arrived as Patricia was speaking, his medical bag in hand and his expression carrying the particular exhaustion that came from treating ailments he couldn't cure with medicine. Doc Henderson was 75, officially retired, but still the only physician within 50 miles willing to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay. His white hair and gentle demeanor masked a sharp intelligence and deep frustration with the social conditions that created many of his patients' health problems. "Morning, Tom, Patricia," Doc said, accepting the coffee that Jake offered. "I wanted to update you about the Kowalski family. Maria's pregnancy is progressing well, but they're living on beans and bread. The baby's going to need proper nutrition, and I can't prescribe food." The Kowalski family represented another dimension of Millfield's decline. Stan Kowalski had worked at the copper mine for 15 years before it closed, and his skills didn't translate to any employment opportunities within 100 miles. His wife Maria was 7 months pregnant with their second child, and their 4-year-old son showed signs of developmental delays that Doc suspected were related to malnutrition, rather than any inherent disability. "What about the county assistance programs?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. 6-month waiting list, and the benefits don't cover basic nutritional needs anyway, Doc replied. "These are good people, Tom. Stan would work 18 hours a day if there were jobs available. But pride doesn't feed children, and bureaucracy doesn't deliver babies." Tom listened to the familiar litany of problems while his mind drifted to the conversation he had avoided having with himself for 6 months. Since Sarah's death, everything in Millfield seemed to reflect his own internal landscape, gray, diminished, and slowly dying despite everyone's best efforts to maintain appearances. Sarah had been the town's unofficial social worker, the person who organized food drives for struggling families, coordinated care for elderly residents, and somehow convinced feuding neighbors to remember their common humanity. She had possessed an intuitive understanding of how communities either healed together or died alone, and her absence had left a vacuum that no amount of official intervention could fill. Mrs. Chen knocked gently on the office door, carrying a covered plate that filled the room with the aroma of fresh-baked bread. Mei Chun was 68, a Chinese immigrant who had come to Millfield 30 years earlier as a young bride and had stayed after her husband's death from mining-related lung disease. She ran a small boarding house that served as temporary shelter for people in transition, and her kitchen had become an unofficial community center where problems were discussed over meals that somehow appeared whenever someone was hungry. "Sheriff Tom, you look too thin," Mrs. Chun announced with a directness that had made her both beloved and slightly feared throughout the community. "Sarah would not approve of you forgetting to eat." Tom accepted the plate gratefully, knowing that arguing with Mrs. Chun about his dietary habits was both futile and unnecessary. She had appointed herself his caretaker after Sarah's funeral, showing up with food and gentle lectures whenever she decided he was neglecting his health or emotional well-being. "Mrs. Chun, have you noticed any new families in town?" Tom asked, something nagging at his memory from the previous evening. "Anyone who might need help but hasn't asked for it?" Mrs. Chun's expression grew thoughtful. "There are always people who need help but are too proud to ask. Sometimes the ones who suffer most quietly are the ones who need help most urgently." The morning proceeded with its familiar rhythm of small crises and administrative duties. Tom reviewed incident reports, mediated a dispute between two shop owners over a parking space, and listened to Jake's enthusiastic plans for community policing initiatives that might work in a town where people still trusted each other. Around noon, Tom walked his regular patrol through downtown Millfield, noting the empty storefronts that outnumbered the occupied businesses 2-1. The Millfield Theater had been closed for 5 years, its marquee advertising a movie that no one remembered watching. The hardware store survived on farming supplies and occasional construction projects, while the bank had reduced its hours and staff to the minimum required to maintain its charter dot at the end of Main Street. Tom paused at the entrance to Millfield Cemetery, where Sarah's headstone bore fresh flowers that Mrs. Chun replaced twice weekly. He had stopped visiting daily after the first month, finding that grief ambushed him more effectively in public places than in the privacy of their empty house. "I don't know what you'd want me to do, Sarah," he said quietly, addressing the marker. That seemed inadequate to contain the memory of a woman who had filled every room with warmth and purpose. "Everything we tried to build here is falling apart, and I don't have your gift for fixing what's broken." The afternoon brought another call to mediate between the Brennan and Walsh families, this time over accusations that someone had been tampering with irrigation equipment. Tom drove out to the disputed property line, where both families had gathered with the kind of angry energy that could escalate quickly if not managed carefully. "Tom, you need to arrest that son of his," shouted Bill Brennan, pointing an accusatory finger at young Danny Walsh. "I caught him messing with my water pump this morning." "Mr. Brennan, Danny was helping me fix a fence post," replied Emma Walsh, Danny's aunt. "He hasn't been near your equipment." Tom spent 40 minutes listening to contradictory accusations and examining evidence that proved nothing except that both families were desperate enough to see enemies where they had once seen neighbors. The real problem wasn't sabotage or theft. It was two proud families fighting over resources that were insufficient for either of them to thrive. "Folks, this creek has supported both your families for 60 years, Tom said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had settled similar disputes hundreds of times. "The drought isn't anyone's fault, and fighting each other won't make it rain. But if you keep this up, you'll both lose your land to lawyers and banks." The families dispersed with grudging agreement to attempt a more formal water-sharing arrangement. But Tom knew the underlying tensions would continue to simmer. Pride and fear made poor foundations for cooperation, and both emotions were abundant in Millfield these days. As evening approached, Tom finished his paperwork and prepared to lock up the office. Jake had gone home to his young wife and infant daughter, carrying with him the kind of hopeful energy that Tom remembered from his own early years in law enforcement. Back then, Tom had believed that dedication and fairness could solve most problems, that communities were fundamentally decent places where good people looked out for each other. Tom walked slowly through the quiet streets of Millfield, noting lights in windows where families gathered for dinner and empty houses where families had once lived. The town felt smaller each year, not just in population, but in spirit. as if the accumulated weight of disappointment had compressed everyone's dreams into more manageable, less ambitious shapes dotted the corner of Main and Elm, where the old Millfield bank building stood empty after the regional consolidation. Tom paused to examine graffiti that someone had spray-painted on the sidewall. When did we stop caring? The question haunted him as he continued his patrol, because he couldn't remember exactly when caring had become a luxury that Millfield could no longer afford. The call came in just after 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening that had started like any other. Tom was finishing his patrol when Jake's voice crackled through the radio with the kind of tension that indicated trouble was escalating beyond normal boundaries. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the Brennan place. Sounds like the water dispute is getting physical. Bill Brennan called it in himself. Says Walsh family members are trespassing and threatening him." Tom sighed and turned his patrol car toward the Brennan ranch, knowing that what awaited him would be another round of the same arguments that had been poisoning relationships throughout the community. The drought had lasted 3 years now, transforming longtime neighbors into suspicious adversaries who measured every drop of water like liquid gold. When Tom arrived at the disputed property line, he found both families facing off across the creek that had become the source of so much bitterness. Bill Brennan stood with his 2 adult sons, while the Walsh family had brought Emma Walsh, her brother David, and their teenage nephew Danny. What should have been a civil discussion between reasonable adults had devolved into shouting match that could be heard across the prairie. "Tom, thank God you're here," Bill Brennan called out, his face red with anger and frustration. "These people think they can just take whatever they want from my land." "Your land?" Emma Walsh shot back, her usually controlled demeanor cracking under months of accumulated stress. "That creek ran through both our properties long before any of us were born. Your grandfather never claimed exclusive rights to water that feeds both ranches." Tom positioned himself between the two groups, using his physical presence and calm voice to diffuse the immediate tension. At 53, he possessed the kind of natural authority that came from treating people fairly over many years, earning respect through consistency rather than intimidation. "Folks, let's all take a step back and remember we're neighbors," Tom said, his voice carrying the measured tone he had perfected for situations that could turn dangerous quickly. "Emma, Bill, you've known each other since you were children. This drought is hard on everyone, but fighting each other won't solve anything." David Walsh, Emma's younger brother, stepped forward with clenched fists and eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Easy for you to say, Tom. The Brennans have been diverting water upstream for months, leaving us with barely enough for our cattle. We're facing bankruptcy because of their greed." "That's a lie," shouted Mike Brennan, Bill's eldest son. "We're taking our fair share and nothing more. If you can't manage your ranch properly, don't blame us for your failures." The argument continued for 20 minutes, with Tom patiently listening to accusations and counter-accusations that revealed the deeper economic fears driving the surface conflicts. Both families were struggling financially. Both were watching their cattle operations shrink due to drought conditions, and both were looking for someone to blame for circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Here's what we're going to do," Tom said finally, when it became clear that the families were too angry to reach any voluntary agreement. "I'm going to measure the creek flow myself and work with the county extension agent to establish fair water allocation. No one touches the irrigation equipment until we get this sorted out officially." The families agreed reluctantly, more from exhaustion than enthusiasm, and began dispersing toward their respective vehicles. Tom was completing his incident report when he noticed movement in the shadows near an abandoned machinery shed at the edge of the Brennan property. A small figure emerged from the darkness, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing a dress that had once been white but was now stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that was far too thin and her eyes held the kind of wariness that Tom had learned to recognize in children who had experienced too much adult tragedy. The girl approached Tom with hesitant steps, glancing nervously at the departing families before focusing her attention on his badge. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried an urgency that made Tom's chest tighten with concern. "Sheriff," she said, tugging gently at his sleeve, "please follow me home. My family needs help." Tom knelt down to bring himself to the girl's eye level, using the gentle approach he had learned during training sessions about dealing with traumatized children. Up close, he could see that her injuries were recent: a cut on her forehead that had stopped bleeding but needed cleaning, bruises on her arms that suggested she had fallen or been grabbed roughly. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Tom asked, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. "Emma," she replied, which caused Tom momentary confusion since Emma Walsh was standing 50 yards away arguing with her brother about drying arrangements. "Emma Cooper," the girl clarified, as if reading his thoughts. "We live in the old farmhouse past the creek. Mama's sick, and baby Johnny won't stop crying, and I don't know what to do anymore." Tom felt his heart rate accelerate as he processed what the girl was telling him. The old Jameson farmhouse had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the elderly couple who owned it had moved to a nursing home in Cheyenne. The property was technically for sale, but no one had shown interest in land that came with a deteriorating house and water rights complications. "Emma, have you and your family been living in the old farmhouse?" Tom asked, though he already suspected the answer from the girl's condition and obvious desperation. Emma nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she struggled to maintain the composure that had apparently been required of her for far too long. "Daddy died in the mine accident last year, and we didn't have anywhere else to go. Mama said we could stay there until she got better and found work, but she keeps getting sicker, and there's no food left, and baby Johnny needs medicine." Tom's mind raced through the implications of what Emma was describing. A widowed mother with 2 young children, living without utilities or adequate shelter in an abandoned house, apparently forgotten by the social service systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. "Emma, I want to help you and your family," Tom said, standing and offering his hand to the girl. "Will you show me where you've been living?" Emma took his hand with the trust that children reserve for adults who speak to them with genuine kindness, and together they walked across the creek toward the abandoned farmhouse that Tom had driven past hundreds of times without suspecting. It harbored a family in crisis. The house sat in a depression behind a stand of cottonwood, trees that partially concealed it from the main road. As they approached, Tom could see that someone had made efforts to maintain the property. Windows had been covered with cardboard and plastic sheeting, and a small garden plot showed evidence of recent cultivation, though the drought had withered most of the vegetables. "Mama's inside with Johnny," Emma explained as they reached the front porch, where improvised repairs with scrap wood and wire suggested months of making do with whatever materials could be found or scavenged. Tom followed Emma through a front door that hung crooked on damaged hinges, entering interior that smelled of sickness, poverty, and the kind of desperation that accumulates when people have been struggling alone for too long. In a back bedroom, Tom found Mary Cooper, a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, but looked much older due to illness and malnutrition. She was lying on a mattress placed directly on the floor, covered with blankets that had seen better days, holding an infant who was crying with the weak, persistent sound that indicated hunger and discomfort. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Harlan," Tom said, removing his hat as he entered the room. "Your daughter Emma asked me to come help you." Mary Cooper tried to sit up, her face flushing with embarrassment at being discovered in such conditions. "Sheriff, I'm sorry. We're not supposed to be here, I know. But we didn't have anywhere else to go after Robert died, and I thought it would just be temporary until I could find work and save enough for proper housing. Tom could see immediately that Mary Cooper was seriously ill. Her skin had the grayish pallor that indicated severe anemia or infection. Her breathing was labored, and she lacked the strength to hold her infant son securely. The baby appeared malnourished but alert, suggesting that Mary had been sacrificing her own health to provide what little nutrition she could manage for her children. "Mrs. Cooper, right now I'm not concerned about property rights or permits," Tom said, pulling out his radio to call for medical assistance. "I'm concerned about getting you and your children the help you need. When did you last see a doctor?" "Not since Johnny was born 8 months ago," Mary admitted, her voice carrying the shame of someone who had been forced to choose between medical care and food. "We don't have insurance, and I couldn't afford the clinic fees." Tom stepped outside to make his radio calls, first requesting emergency medical assistance and then calling Mrs. Chun to arrange temporary shelter for the family. As he waited for help to arrive, Emma Cooper stood beside him on the broken porch, her small hand still holding his with the trust of a child who had finally found an adult willing to take responsibility for solving problems that no 8-year-old should have to face alone. Doc Henderson arrived within 30 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his expression growing increasingly grim as he examined Mary Cooper and her infant son. Tom watched from the doorway as the elderly physician worked with the gentle efficiency of someone who had spent 50 years treating patients under less than ideal conditions. "Mary, how long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" Doc asked, checking her pulse and noting the obvious signs of severe anemia and possible infection. "Since Johnny was born," Mary replied weakly. "Maybe longer. It's hard to remember when I started feeling sick all the time." Doc Henderson completed his examination and stepped outside with Tom, his weathered face showing the kind of controlled anger that came from encountering preventable suffering. "Tom, that woman has a serious infection that's been untreated for months. The baby is malnourished but otherwise healthy, considering the circumstances. Both of them need immediate medical intervention. What kind of treatment are we talking about?" Tom asked, though he suspected the answer would involve resources that Mary Cooper couldn't afford. "Antibiotics, 4 fluids, proper nutrition, and follow-up care that should have started months ago," Doc replied. "The baby needs vitamin supplements and a feeding schedule that ensures adequate nutrition for proper development." Tom felt his anger building as he considered how a family with young children could fall through every social safety net that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. "Doc, what would it cost to provide the treatment they need?" "More than she can afford, obviously, or she wouldn't be living in an abandoned house," Doc said bluntly. "Tom, I'll treat them regardless of their ability to pay, but someone needs to address the underlying problems that created this situation." Emma Cooper had been listening from the porch, her 8-year-old face showing the kind of mature concern that children develop when they're forced to take adult responsibilities too early. She approached Tom with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Sheriff, will Mama get better now? And can we stay somewhere with electricity and running water?" Tom knelt down to Emma's level, choosing his words carefully because he understood that his answer would shape how this child viewed the reliability of adult promises. "Emma, Dr. Henderson is going to take very good care of your mama and baby, Johnny, and I'm going to make sure your family has a safe place to stay while they get better." Tom called Mrs. Chun while Doc Henderson prepared Mary and the baby for transport to his clinic. Mrs. Chun's boarding house was the closest thing Millfield had to emergency family housing, and her instinctive compassion made her the logical choice for providing temporary shelter. "Mrs. Chun, I have a family that needs immediate help," Tom explained. "A mother with a serious infection, an 8-month-old baby, and an 8-year-old girl who's been caring for both of them. They've been living in the abandoned Jameson farmhouse without utilities or adequate food. Bring them to me immediately." Mrs. Chun replied without hesitation. "I have rooms available, and the kitchen is always ready to feed people who are hungry. The logistics of relocating the Cooper family revealed the extent of their poverty and isolation. Their possessions fit into 2 cardboard boxes and a plastic garbage bag clothing that was clean but worn thin, a few children's books, and baby supplies that had been stretched far beyond their intended use. Tom carried the boxes while Emma walked beside him, her hand holding tightly to baby Johnny's blanket as if it were a lifeline connecting her to the fragile stability they were attempting to create. Mary Cooper was too weak to walk far, so Doc Henderson transported her in his personal vehicle to avoid the cost and bureaucracy of an ambulance. Mrs. Chun met them at her boarding house with the kind of organized efficiency that came from years of managing crises. She had prepared 2 adjoining rooms, started a pot of soup that would be gentle on Mary's compromised digestive system, and assembled baby supplies that previous tenants had left behind. "This little girl has been carrying too much responsibility," Mrs. Chun observed after helping Emma wash and change into clean clothing that had been donated by other community members. "She needs to remember how to be a child." Tom found himself studying Emma Cooper's behavior as she explored her temporary new home. The girl moved with cautious wonder, touching furniture and fixtures as if testing whether they were real or would disappear if handled too roughly. When Mrs. Chun offered her a glass of milk and a sandwich, Emma asked if she could save half for later, the instinctive hoarding behavior of someone who had experienced genuine hunger. "Emma, there's plenty of food here," Tom assured her. "You don't need to save anything. Mrs. Chun will make sure you and your family have everything you need." Over dinner, Tom learned more about the Cooper family's circumstances. Robert Cooper had died in a mining accident 11 months earlier, when a poorly maintained support beam collapsed in one of the older sections of the Millfield copper mine. Mary had been 7 months pregnant at the time, working as a part-time bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Robert was trying to organize the miners to demand better safety equipment. Mary explained, her voice growing stronger after a day of medical treatment and adequate nutrition. He said the company was cutting corners that put men's lives at risk. Then the accident happened, and suddenly no one wanted to talk about safety concerns anymore. Tom made notes about the mining accident, realizing that he had never seen an official report about the incident or any follow-up investigation. Industrial accidents were typically handled by state authorities, but the lack of community discussion suggested that the matter had been resolved quietly and perhaps not entirely transparently. "Mary, did you receive any benefits or compensation after Robert's death?" Tom asked, suspecting the answer, but needing to understand how a mining widow with young children had ended up homeless and forgotten. "The company said there were problems with Robert's employment classification," Mary replied, her voice carrying the bitterness of someone who had been systematically denied help she deserved. "They claimed he was an independent contractor rather than an employee, so there were no death benefits or insurance coverage." Emma Cooper looked up from her coloring book, where she had been drawing pictures of houses with families inside. "Daddy said the boss was lying about the safety rules. He said someone was going to get hurt if they didn't fix the broken parts." Tom felt his investigative instincts awakening for the first time in months. Something about Robert Cooper's death and the family's subsequent treatment suggested a pattern of institutional indifference that went beyond simple bureaucratic oversight. "Mrs. Chun, would it be possible for the Cooper family to stay here for a few weeks while we sort out their longer-term housing situation?" Tom asked, knowing that the elderly woman's kindness was sometimes strained by her limited resources. "Sheriff Tom, these children will stay as long as they need," Mrs. Chun replied firmly. "A community that cannot protect its mothers and babies is not worthy of the name." That evening, Tom sat in his office, reviewing what little documentation he could find about Robert Cooper's mining accident. The official file was surprisingly thin, a basic incident report that attributed the death to equipment failure and a brief statement that appropriate safety measures were being reviewed. There was no mention of worker complaints about safety conditions or any investigation into whether the accident could have been prevented. Emma Cooper's words echoed in Tom's mind as he drove home to his empty house. Daddy said someone was going to get hurt if they didn't fix the broken parts. If Robert Cooper had been trying to organize miners around safety concerns, his death might have been more than just a tragic accident. It might have been the predictable result of prioritizing profits over worker protection. For the first time since Sarah's death, Tom felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had once driven his commitment to law enforcement. The Cooper family's suffering was not just a personal tragedy. It was a symptom of systemic problems that demanded investigation and accountability. The following morning, Tom found Emma Cooper in Mrs. Chun's kitchen, carefully feeding baby Johnny while her mother rested upstairs. The transformation in the little girl was remarkable: clean clothing, properly brushed hair, and the kind of relaxed posture that came from sleeping in a warm bed without fear of discovery or eviction. "How is everyone feeling today?" Tom asked, accepting the cup of coffee that Mrs. Chun offered along with a meaningful look that suggested important conversations were needed. "Mama slept through the night for the first time in months," Emma replied, her voice carrying a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "Dr. Henderson said her fever is gone, and Johnny ate a whole bottle without crying." Mrs. Chun joined them at the kitchen table, bringing with her a manila folder that Tom recognized as one of the record-keeping systems she used to track her boarding house residents. "Sheriff Tom, this child has been telling me stories about her family that you need to hear." Emma looked between the two adults, clearly uncertain about how much she should reveal about experiences that had been her responsibility to manage alone. Tom sensed that gaining her trust would require patience and the kind of gentle questioning that allowed children to share traumatic information at their own pace. "Emma, I want to help your family in every way I can," Tom said, settling into the chair across from her. "But to do that, I need to understand what happened after your daddy died. Can you tell me about how you ended up living in the old farmhouse?" Emma's small hands wrapped around her glass of milk as she considered how to explain months of accumulated trauma and displacement. "After Daddy died, the mine people said we had to leave our house because Daddy didn't really work for them. Mama tried to find another place, but everywhere wanted money we didn't have." Tom made notes while Emma continued her story, her 8-year-old vocabulary struggling to describe adult concepts of employment classification, insurance denial, and housing discrimination. What emerged was a picture of systematic abandonment: a grieving widow and her children pushed out of company housing, denied benefits, and gradually isolated from community support systems. "We stayed with Mama's sister for a while, but her husband said we were too much trouble," Emma continued. "Then we lived in the car until it broke down, and Mama found the empty house where nobody was living." Mrs. Chun's expression grew increasingly grim as Emma described months of improvised survival, washing clothes in the creek, gathering wild berries and vegetables when possible, and carefully rationing whatever food Mary Cooper could afford from her sporadic house-cleaning jobs. "Emma, during this time, did anyone from the county or state ever come to check on your family?" Tom asked, knowing that multiple agencies were supposed to monitor children in crisis situations. "Mama said we had to hide when official cars came around," Emma replied. "She was afraid they would take me and Johnny away if they knew we didn't have a proper house." Tom felt his anger building as he realized that Mary Cooper's fears about Child Protective Services had prevented her from seeking help that might have addressed their housing and medical needs months earlier. The system designed to protect vulnerable families had instead driven them into hiding, creating exactly the kind of dangerous situation it was meant to prevent. "Mrs. Chun, have there been other families in similar situations that we might not know about?" Tom asked, suspecting that The Cooper family's experience might not be unique. Sheriff Tom, proud people suffer in silence rather than ask for help that makes them feel like failures, Mrs. Chun replied. In my country, we had saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Sometimes people learn to hide their problems instead of seeking solutions. After breakfast, Tom drove to the site of Robert Cooper's mining accident, wanting to examine the location and understand the circumstances that had led to a safety-conscious worker's death. The Millfield copper mine had been partially closed for 2 years, with only the most profitable sections remaining in operation under a management company that had purchased the assets during bankruptcy proceedings. The accident site was in Section 7, one of the older areas of the mine where tunnels had been excavated during the 1960s using less sophisticated safety standards. Tom met with Jerry Morrison, the current mine supervisor, who seemed uncomfortable discussing the circumstances of Robert Cooper's death. Sheriff, that was a real tragedy, Jerry said, his tone suggesting that the conversation was one he preferred to avoid. Robert was a good worker, but that section of the mine had structural problems that we've been working to address. Jerry, what specific problems were the miners reporting before the accident? Tom asked, pulling out his notebook to record details that might not have been included in the official incident report. Jerry shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if checking whether their conversation might be overheard. Robert had been vocal about some of the older support beams needing replacement. Said the company was pushing production schedules without adequate attention to maintenance. Did anyone investigate these safety concerns before the accident occurred? That's really a question for the management company, Sheriff. I just supervise day-to-day operations. Policy decisions come from the corporate office. Tom spent an hour examining the accident site, noting evidence of hasty repairs and newer support structures that suggested Jerry's explanation was incomplete. The area where Robert Cooper had died showed signs of structural problems that would have been obvious to experienced miners, raising questions about why work had continued in a demonstrably dangerous section. On his way back to town, Tom stopped at the small apartment where the Kowalski family lived, wanting to check on Maria's pregnancy and compare their situation to what he had learned about the Cooper family's experiences. Stan Kowalski answered the door with the wary expression of a man who had learned to expect bad news from official visits. Sheriff, is there a problem? Stan asked, though his tone suggested relief that Tom was alone rather than accompanied by social services representatives or debt collectors. Stan, I wanted to check on Maria and see if there's anything the county can do to help during her pregnancy, Tom replied, noting the sparse furnishings and obvious signs of financial stress throughout the small apartment. Maria Kowalski appeared from the bedroom, 7 months pregnant and carrying their 4-year-old son, who seemed smaller and quieter than children his age typically appeared. She welcomed Tom with nervous hospitality, offering coffee that they probably couldn't afford to share. Dr. Henderson says the baby is healthy, but I worry about nutrition, Maria admitted. We're doing our best. That Stan's unemployment benefits ran out last month, and there aren't any jobs within driving distance. Tom learned that Stan had worked at the copper mine for 15 years before the partial closure eliminated his position. His skills were specific to mining operations, and retraining programs required travel and expenses that were beyond the family's current resources. Stan, did you know Robert Cooper? Tom asked, sensing an opportunity to learn more about the mining accident from someone who had worked alongside the deceased man. Robert was a good man, Sheriff. Always looking out for the younger guys, teaching them to work safely, Stan replied. He was organizing meetings about safety problems in the older sections. Said the company was cutting corners that could get people killed. What happened to those safety meetings after Robert died? Stan and Maria exchanged glances that suggested they were treading into territory that made them uncomfortable. Sheriff, "We've got our own problems to worry about," Stan said finally. "Getting involved in company business doesn't help families who need work." Tom understood the underlying message. People who depended on mining employment, even intermittent employment, couldn't afford to challenge company practices too aggressively. The economic power imbalance made it dangerous for workers to advocate for safety improvements that might be seen as criticizing management decisions. That afternoon, Tom visited Frank Morrison's general store, hoping to learn more about how the Cooper family situation had remained hidden from community awareness. Frank was stocking shelves with canned goods, moving slowly due to arthritis that made physical work increasingly difficult. "Frank, do you remember Mary Cooper shopping here after her husband died?" Tom asked, helping to arrange merchandise while they talked. "Poor woman tried to stretch every dollar as far as possible," Frank replied. "Always paid cash, usually for the cheapest items available. I offered to extend credit, but she said she couldn't take on debt with no way to pay it back." "Did you?" "No, she and her children were living in the abandoned Jameson farmhouse." Frank stopped working and looked directly at Tom with surprise and obvious regret. "Sheriff, if I had known those children were living without proper shelter, I would have done something. Mary Cooper always seemed proud, but managing. I never suspected they were in real crisis." Tom realized that Mary Cooper's determination to maintain dignity had prevented her from revealing the extent of her family's desperation. By appearing to manage independently, she had inadvertently made herself invisible to the informal support networks that might have provided assistance as evening approached. Tom returned to Mrs. Chun's boarding house to check on the Cooper family's adjustment to their temporary housing. He found Emma in the living room, reading a picture book to baby Johnny while her mother rested upstairs, still recovering from months of untreated illness. "Emma, are you feeling more settled here?" Tom asked, sitting in the chair beside the couch where she had arranged blankets and pillows to create a comfortable reading area. "It's the nicest place we've lived since Daddy died," Emma replied, though her voice carried undertones of uncertainty about how long such comfort might last. "Mrs. Chun says we can stay as long as we need, but Mama worries about being charity cases." Tom pulled out a faded family photograph that Mrs. Chun had found among the Cooper family's possessions, a picture of Robert Cooper with his wife and young daughter, taken during happier times when the future had seemed secure and predictable. "Emma, your daddy looks like he was a good man who cared about his family," Tom said, studying the image of a worker in mining gear standing proudly beside his pregnant wife and toddler daughter. "Daddy always said that families have to take care of each other because nobody else will," Emma replied, her small finger tracing the outline of her father's face in the photograph. "He said that's why he had to make the mine safer for all the daddies who worked there." Tom felt the weight of Robert Cooper's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. A man had died trying to protect his co-workers, leaving behind a family that had been abandoned by the systems meant to provide support during crisis. The least Tom could do was ensure that Robert Cooper's concerns about mine safety received the investigation they deserved, even if that investigation came too late to save his life. That evening, Tom sat in his empty house holding Sarah's journal, a leather-bound notebook that he had avoided opening since her death 6 months earlier. The weight of the Cooper family's crisis had awakened something in him that demanded guidance, and Sarah's words had always provided clarity during difficult times. The journal's pages chronicled Sarah's volunteer work with struggling families, her observations about community dynamics, and her frustration with systems that failed the people who needed help most. Her handwriting, careful and determined, seemed to speak directly to Tom's current situation as he read entries that could have been written about the Cooper family. March 15th. Visited the Martinez family today. Pride keeps people from asking for help until crisis becomes catastrophe. How do we create safety nets that catch people before they fall so far? Community responsibility can't wait for government solutions. Tom continued reading, finding entry after entry that demonstrated Sarah's understanding of how poverty and isolation compounded each other, creating situations where families suffered in silence rather than risk the shame of public assistance. June 8th. Mrs. Patterson finally admitted that her husband's disability payments aren't enough to cover their medication costs. They've been rationing insulin for 3 months, risking his life to avoid asking neighbors for help. When did independence become more important than survival? Sarah's journal revealed a comprehensive understanding of Millfield's hidden poverty families, who maintained appearances while struggling with food insecurity, medical debt, and housing instability. She had documented case after case of people falling through bureaucratic cracks, creating an informal record of community needs that no official agency had bothered to compile. September 22nd, organized clothing drive for school children. Amazing how many families need help, but won't admit it directly. Emma Walsh mentioned that some kids don't have warm coats for winter. Took me an hour to realize she was talking about her own grandchildren. Tom found himself crying as he read. Sarah's careful documentation of community suffering and her tireless efforts to address problems that seemed to multiply faster than solutions could be implemented. Her journal was not just a record of volunteer work. It was a blueprint for the kind of community engagement that could prevent families like the Coopers from falling into crisis. The next morning, Tom arrived at his office to find Doc Henderson waiting with a manila folder containing Mary Cooper's medical records. The elderly physician's expression carried the controlled anger that Tom had learned to associate with preventable suffering. "Tom, I need you to understand the extent of medical neglect that Mary Cooper has endured," Doc said, opening the folder to reveal test results and treatment notes. Her infection was life-threatening, and the malnutrition has caused problems that will require months of careful treatment to correct. How long has she been sick without proper medical care? Tom asked, though he suspected the answer would be measured in seasons rather than weeks. Based on her symptoms and test results, I'd estimate 8 to 10 months of progressive illness. The infection probably started during childbirth, when she didn't receive adequate postnatal care due to insurance problems. Tom studied the medical reports, translating clinical language into human terms that revealed systematic failures at multiple levels. Mary Cooper had given birth without adequate medical support, developed complications that went untreated due to financial barriers, and gradually deteriorated while trying to care for 2 young children alone. "Doc, if this situation had been identified earlier, could it have been prevented?" "Tom, this is exactly the kind of medical crisis that routine social services are designed to catch. Pregnant women without insurance, families with young children living in substandard housing, mothers showing signs of serious illness. Any functioning safety net should have identified and addressed these problems months ago." Doc Henderson's assessment reinforced Tom's growing conviction that the Cooper family's suffering represented failures that extended far beyond individual misfortune. Institutional systems had failed to protect vulnerable citizens, community networks had failed to identify neighbors in crisis, and local leadership had failed to ensure that basic human needs were being met. Later that morning, Tom received a phone call from Mayor Patricia Wells, who had learned about the Cooper family situation through the informal communication networks that made privacy impossible in small towns. "Tom, we need to discuss the implications of this family's situation for the town's reputation and resources," Patricia said, her political instincts clearly focused on damage control rather than problem solving. "Patricia, right now I'm focused on making sure a mother and 2 children have adequate food, shelter, and medical care," Tom replied, his voice carrying an edge that suggested limited patience for bureaucratic concerns. "Of course, and that's commendable. But we also need to consider how this situation reflects on Millfield social services and whether there might be other families in similar circumstances that we're not aware of." Tom realized that Patricia's concerns were actually more perceptive than he had initially assumed. If the Cooper family could fall through every safety net without detection, other families might be experiencing similar hidden crises throughout the community. Patricia, I think we need to conduct a comprehensive review of families with young children, especially those who have experienced job loss or medical emergencies in the past year, Tom suggested. Sarah's journal documents several cases of hidden poverty that official agencies never identified. Sarah kept records of community needs, detailed records with specific families and circumstances. Reading her journal is like discovering a parallel community where people are struggling with problems that our official systems never address. That afternoon, Tom met with Mrs. Chun to discuss expanding her boarding house's capacity for emergency family housing. The elderly woman had been thinking about the broader implications of the Cooper family situation, applying her own experiences with displacement and community support. Sheriff Tom, in China I learned that communities survive by taking care of everyone, not just people who can pay for help, Mrs. Chun said as they walked through the rooms that could potentially house additional families. When disasters come, rich and poor suffer together unless they help each other. Mrs. Chun, how many families do you think could be housed here if we converted some of the larger rooms? With proper organization, maybe 3 families with children. But families need more than shelter. They need dignity, purpose, and hope for future independence. Tom spent the remainder of the afternoon visiting families throughout Millfield, guided by references in Sarah's journal to households that had experienced economic hardship or medical crises. What he discovered was a hidden landscape of quiet desperation families, making impossible choices between rent and medical care. Parents skipping meals to ensure their children had adequate nutrition. Elderly residents rationing prescription medications to make monthly supplies last longer. At the Kowalski apartment, Tom found Maria preparing dinner that consisted primarily of pasta and canned tomatoes, stretching ingredients to provide adequate portions for her husband and 4-year-old son, while reserving the smallest serving for herself. Maria, are you eating enough to support your pregnancy? Tom asked gently, noting her pale complexion and the careful way she portioned the limited food. Sheriff, we make sure everyone gets fed, Maria replied, though her evasive answer confirmed Tom's suspicions about her own nutritional status. The pattern repeated throughout his visits. Proud families, maintaining appearances while making sacrifices that threatened their health and long-term stability. Each household revealed another dimension of community needs that had been invisible to official oversight, creating a comprehensive picture of widespread hidden poverty that demanded systematic intervention rather than individual charity. As evening approached, Tom returned to Mrs. Chun's boarding house to check on Emma Cooper's adjustment and continue learning about her family's experiences. He found her in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Chun prepare dinner with the careful attention of a child who had learned to appreciate abundance after experiencing scarcity. 3 days later, Tom's systematic investigation of family needs throughout Millfield had revealed a disturbing pattern. In nearly every household he visited, he discovered families quietly struggling with financial hardship, medical debt, or housing insecurity that they had been hiding from community awareness. The most shocking discovery came when Tom visited the Walsh family ranch, where Emma Walsh's elderly parents were living in conditions that bordered on destitution, despite their appearance of maintaining a successful cattle operation. Tom found Walter Walsh, 74, sitting at his kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills that totaled more than his ranch's annual income. Walter, I had no idea you and Martha were facing financial difficulties, Tom said, studying the collection of medical bills, equipment loans, and property tax notices that covered the table. Sheriff, we've been proud folks all our lives, Walter replied, his weathered hand shaking slightly as he organized the bills into categories. Martha's cancer treatments last year cost more than we made in 3 years of ranching. Insurance covered maybe half. Martha Walsh appeared from the bedroom, using a walker to navigate the hallway with careful, deliberate steps. At 72, she showed the effects of chemotherapy and radiation treatments that had saved her life but depleted their financial resources. "Tom, we didn't want the children to know how bad things got," Martha said, settling into her chair with obvious fatigue. "Emma and David have their own families to support. We thought we could manage until the next cattle sale." Tom realized that the Brennan Walsh water dispute that had consumed so much of his attention was actually a symptom of deeper economic desperation. Both families were facing foreclosure, and the argument over water rights was really a fight between two drowning families over insufficient resources. "Martha, Walter, how long have you been struggling to pay these medical bills?" "Since Martha was diagnosed 18 months ago," Walter admitted. "We've been selling cattle and equipment to cover treatment costs, but we're running out of assets to liquidate." The stack of unpaid bills told a story of systematic financial destruction. Medical expenses that had consumed the family's savings, forced the sale of livestock and equipment, and created a debt spiral that threatened to claim the ranch that had been in the Walsh family for 4 generations. "Walter, did you apply for assistance programs or medical hardship relief?" "Sheriff, we tried every program we could find. Too much income to qualify for poverty assistance. Too little income to afford the medical bills. Seems like the system is designed to help people who are completely destitute or wealthy enough not to need help." Tom found similar stories throughout his investigation. The Peterson family was facing foreclosure after their son's motorcycle accident required emergency surgery that exceeded their insurance coverage. The Morrison family was rationing prescription medications for their diabetic daughter because the cost of insulin had tripled over the past year. Each family had maintained appearances of stability while making impossible choices between basic needs, creating a community where hidden suffering was endemic but unaddressed because people were too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to admit their struggles. That afternoon, Tom met with Frank Morrison at the general store to discuss the scope of hidden poverty that his investigation had revealed. Frank was reconciling accounts that showed the financial stress affecting most of his customers. "Tom, half my regular customers are buying only the cheapest necessities," Frank said, reviewing sales records that documented declining purchases of anything beyond basic survival needs. People who used to shop for their families are now buying single items and paying in exact change. "Frank, how many families do you think are struggling financially but haven't asked for help?" "Sheriff, I'd estimate that 60% of the families in this county are one emergency away from serious financial crisis. Most of them are working people who make just enough to disqualify them from assistance programs, but not enough to handle unexpected expenses." Frank's assessment aligned with Tom's own observations from visiting households throughout Millfield. The community's economic foundation was far more fragile than anyone had realized, with families maintaining a facade of stability while living on the edge of financial collapse. What would it take to provide meaningful support to families before they reach crisis situations? "Tom, we'd need coordination between businesses, medical providers, social services, and probably some kind of emergency fund that could help people bridge temporary gaps without forcing them into long-term debt." That evening, Tom returned to Sarah's journal, searching for insights about how communities could address widespread poverty without creating dependency or destroying the dignity that was so important to proud families. Sarah's entries revealed sophisticated thinking about community support systems that preserve both independence and mutual aid. October 12th. Successful communities create ways for people to help each other without charity stigma. Work programs, skill sharing, cooperative purchasing methods that allow people to contribute while receiving assistance. Dignity is as important as material support. Sarah had understood intuitively what Tom was discovering through his investigation, that sustainable community support required systems that allowed people to maintain their self-respect while receiving help during difficult periods. November 3rd. Talked with Mrs. Chun about her boarding house model. Tenants contribute what they can: money, labor, skills, child care for other families. Everyone gives something. Everyone receives something. No one is just a charity case. Tom realized that Mrs. Chun's boarding house was actually a model for the kind of community support system that could address widespread need without creating dependency. Families contributed according to their abilities while receiving assistance according to their needs, maintaining dignity through mutual aid rather than one-way charity. The next morning, Tom convened a meeting with Doc Henderson, Mayor Wells, Mrs. Chun, and Frank Morrison to discuss creating a coordinated response to the community needs that his investigation had documented. "Folks, we have a choice," Tom began, presenting the summary of his findings. "We can continue pretending that isolated families in crisis are individual problems, or we can acknowledge that we have systematic community needs that require coordinated solutions." Doc Henderson reviewed the medical implications of widespread hidden poverty. Tom, delayed medical care due to financial barriers is creating health crises that are more expensive and dangerous than preventive treatment would have been. Mayor Wells expressed concerns about the political and budgetary implications of acknowledging widespread community poverty. "Tom, if we officially recognize the scope of need you've documented, we'll be obligated to provide services that are beyond our current resources. Patricia, we're already paying the costs of unaddressed poverty through emergency medical care, family crisis interventions, and social problems that could be prevented with earlier intervention," Tom replied. "The question is whether we pay for solutions or continue paying for crisis management." Mrs. Chun offered the wisdom of someone who had experienced both displacement and community support. "In my experience, communities that help everyone survive. Difficult times become stronger. Communities that abandon struggling families become weaker until they cannot survive their own crises." The meeting concluded with agreement to develop a pilot program based on Mrs. Chun's boarding house, model a community support system that would provide emergency assistance while maintaining dignity through mutual aid and shared responsibility. Tom's investigation into Robert Cooper's mining accident took an unexpected turn when Emma Cooper made an innocent comment that reframed everything he thought he understood about her father's death. Tom was reading to her and baby Johnny when she pointed to a photograph of miners that Mrs. Chun had found in the local historical society's collection. "That man looks like Daddy's friend who came to our old house before the accident," Emma said, pointing to a figure in mining gear standing beside what appeared to be damaged equipment. Tom studied the photograph more carefully, noting that it had been taken in Section 7 of the Millfield copper mine, the same area where Robert Cooper had died 6 months later. The image showed clear evidence of structural problems with support beams and safety equipment, suggesting that the accident site had been dangerous for much longer than anyone had admitted. "Emma, do you remember this friend's name?" Tom asked, keeping his voice casual while his investigative instinct sharpened with renewed focus. "Mr. Stevens, I think. He and Daddy talked about fixing broken things at work. Mr. Stevens was scared that someone would get hurt." Tom felt his pulse accelerate as he realized that Emma was describing a witness to safety concerns who had apparently never been interviewed as part of the official accident investigation. If other miners had been aware of structural problems in Section 7, the accident might have been preventable through proper maintenance and safety protocols. The next morning, Tom drove to the current address he found for James Stevens, a former miner who had left Millfield shortly after Robert Cooper's death. Stevens lived in a trailer park outside Cheyenne, working construction jobs that barely covered his basic living expenses. Stevens answered the door with the wariness of a man who had learned to expect trouble from unexpected visitors. He was 48, weathered by hard physical labor, and obviously surprised to see a sheriff's uniform on his doorstep. "Mr. Stevens, I'm investigating the circumstances surrounding Robert Cooper's death at the Millfield mine," Tom said, showing his badge and explaining his official capacity. "I understand you worked with Robert and may have information about safety conditions in Section 7. Stevens' expression immediately became guarded, and he glanced around the trailer park as if checking whether their conversation might be observed. "Sheriff, that accident was investigated by the proper authorities. I don't have anything to add to the official record." "Mr. Stevens, I'm not questioning the official investigation. I'm trying to understand the safety concerns that Robert was reportedly organizing around before his death." Stevens hesitated for several seconds before stepping outside and closing the trailer door behind him. "Sheriff, can I ask why you're investigating an accident that happened almost a year ago?" Tom explained about discovering the Cooper family's situation and learning that Robert had been trying to organize miners around safety concerns before his death. Stevens listened with growing agitation, occasionally looking around the trailer park with obvious nervousness. "Sheriff, Robert Cooper was trying to document safety violations that could have gotten all of us killed," Stevens said finally. "Section 7 had structural problems that management knew about but refused to address because repairs would have shut down production. What specific problems were you and Robert documenting?" Stevens described the systematic pattern of deferred maintenance, inadequate safety equipment, and production quotas that pressured miners to work in dangerous conditions. Robert Cooper had been collecting evidence and organizing co-workers to demand proper safety protocols when the accident occurred. Robert had photographs, documentation, even recordings of supervisors telling us to ignore safety protocols to meet production schedules, Stevens continued. He was planning to file complaints with state mining authorities the week after he died. Tom felt his understanding of the accident shifting from tragic misfortune to potential criminal negligence. "Mr. Stevens, what happened to Robert's documentation after his death?" "That's when things got scary, Sheriff. The day after Robert died, management told all of us that anyone discussing the accident with outside investigators would be terminated immediately. Then they offered severance packages to miners who were willing to relocate to company operations in other states." Stevens explained that most of the miners who had been working with Robert on safety documentation had accepted relocation packages within weeks of the accident. Those who remained had been required to sign new employment agreements that included non-disclosure clauses about safety conditions and accident circumstances. "Sheriff, they made it clear that talking about what really happened in Section 7 would cost us our jobs and our ability to work in mining anywhere in the region." Tom understood that Stevens and other miners had been systematically silenced through economic pressure and legal intimidation. The official accident investigation had been conducted without access to the workers who best understood the safety problems that had led to Robert Cooper's death. "Mr. Stevens, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about the safety conditions and Robert's documentation efforts?" Stevens' internal struggle was visible as he weighed the risks of speaking publicly against his obvious desire to honor Robert Cooper's memory and prevent future accidents. "Sheriff, I've got a family to support, and construction work doesn't pay enough for me to make enemies with mining companies." Tom spent another hour with Stevens, gradually earning his trust and learning details about the cover-up that had followed Robert Cooper's death. The picture that emerged was of systematic corporate misconduct, designed to avoid liability and regulatory scrutiny. Stevens eventually agreed to provide a confidential statement with the understanding that Tom would protect his identity until formal legal proceedings required his testimony. The statement documented safety violations, management pressure to ignore protocols, and Robert Cooper's efforts to organize worker protection advocacy. On his drive back to Millfield, Tom called the State Mining Safety Office to request copies of the official accident investigation file. The conversation with the state investigator revealed additional troubling information about how the case had been handled. Sheriff Harlan, the Millfield case was unusual because the company's initial report was very thorough and seemed to address all relevant safety factors, the investigator explained. When we arrived to conduct our own investigation, most of the physical evidence had already been removed for safety reasons, and the workers we interviewed all gave consistent statements that supported the company's version of events. Tom realized that the mining company had orchestrated a comprehensive cover-up that had successfully prevented state investigators from discovering the safety violations that had caused Robert Cooper's death. The consistent worker statements had been manufactured through economic coercion rather than reflecting genuine witness accounts. Was there any follow-up investigation when safety advocates raised concerns about the official findings? Sheriff, we never received any complaints or additional evidence about the Millfield case. As far as our records show, it was a straightforward industrial accident with no indication of management negligence or safety violations. Tom understood that Robert Cooper's death had been systematically concealed through a combination of evidence: destruction, witness intimidation, and regulatory manipulation. The mining company had used its economic power to silence workers and control the narrative about what had caused the accident. That evening, Tom met with Doc Henderson to review medical records related to Robert Cooper's death and the treatment of other miners who had worked in Section 7. Doc's records revealed a pattern of injuries and health problems consistent with unsafe working conditions. Tom, I treated several miners for injuries related to structural failures in the months before Robert's accident, Doc said, reviewing his files. Falls caused by equipment failures, respiratory problems from inadequate ventilation, cuts from defective safety equipment. Doc, did anyone from the mining company or state investigators ever request these medical records during the accident investigation? Never. And when I offered to provide information about the pattern of safety-related injuries, I was told that individual medical incidents weren't relevant to the specific accident investigation. Doc Henderson's medical records provided corroborating evidence for Stephen's account of systematic safety violations. The pattern of injuries documented medical proof that Section 7 had been dangerous for months before Robert Cooper's death. Tom realized that he was uncovering evidence of criminal negligence that had been deliberately concealed through corporate manipulation of official investigations. Robert Cooper had died trying to protect his coworkers, and his family had been abandoned as part of a comprehensive effort to avoid legal and financial responsibility for preventable workplace deaths. The prospect of state and federal support gave Tom confidence that seeking justice for Robert Cooper would not require him to face corporate retaliation alone. But he also understood that exposing the truth would fundamentally change relationships within Millfield's power structure, potentially making enemies of people he had worked with for decades. Tom's final preparation involved ensuring that the Cooper family would be protected from any retaliation that might result from his investigation. The mining company had already demonstrated willingness to use economic pressure and legal intimidation to silence critics, and Mary Cooper's vulnerable status made her a potential target for renewed harassment. Mrs. Chun, if things get difficult for the Cooper family because of my investigation, will you make sure they have a safe place to stay? Tom asked during one of their planning conversations about community support systems. Sheriff Tom, this family has already suffered because powerful people chose money over human lives. Mrs. Chun replied with the determination that had sustained her through her own experiences with displacement and persecution. They will be protected here regardless of what threats are made by people who profit from worker deaths. Tom spent his final evening before confronting the mining company at Sarah's grave, seeking guidance from the woman whose moral clarity had always helped him navigate difficult decisions. The cemetery was quiet, except for the wind through the cottonwood trees, and Sarah's headstone reflected moonlight that seemed to illuminate the path forward. "Sarah, I'm about to take on some powerful people who won't appreciate having their crimes exposed," Tom said quietly, addressing the marker that represented everything he had lost and everything he was fighting to preserve. "I know you would tell me that doing the right thing is more important than avoiding trouble, but I wanted you to know that I'm scared about what this might cost." The silence that followed seemed to carry Sarah's voice, reminding him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when justice demanded action. Robert Cooper had died trying to protect his coworkers, and his family had suffered because institutional systems had failed to provide appropriate support during their crisis. Tom's investigation had revealed that individual tragedies, like the Cooper family's suffering, were often symptoms of systematic problems that required institutional accountability to prevent future occurrences. Robert Cooper's death could either remain a forgotten accident or become a catalyst for reforms that would protect other workers and their families. The next morning, Tom arrived at his office to find a message that the mining company's corporate attorneys wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss concerns about ongoing investigations into resolved safety matters. The timing suggested that company officials had learned about his investigation and were attempting to control the narrative before formal charges were filed. Tom called Assistant Attorney General Martinez to coordinate the response to the mining company's illegal maneuvering. "Rebecca, they're trying to get ahead of the investigation by framing it as harassment of a company that has already addressed safety concerns through proper channels." "Sheriff, that's exactly the kind of intimidation tactic we've seen in other cases. Don't meet with their attorneys without state representation present. We'll handle any communications with corporate counsel from this point forward." The involvement of state authorities marked the beginning of formal legal proceedings that would determine whether Robert Cooper's death resulted in accountability or remained another example of corporate power prevailing over worker safety and community welfare. Tom understood that the next phase of his investigation would transform him from a small town sheriff managing routine disputes into a key figure in a case that could influence mining safety regulations and corporate accountability throughout the region. The responsibility was intimidating, but Emma Cooper's trust and the memory of her father's courage provided the motivation. He needed to see the fight through to its conclusion. Jake Martinez arrived at the office with coffee and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "Sheriff, Mrs. Chun called to say that some men in suits were asking questions around town about the Cooper family and your investigation." Tom felt his protective instincts sharpen as he realized that corporate investigators were already working to intimidate potential witnesses and gather information that could be used to discredit his case. The battle for justice was beginning, and the stakes included not just accountability for past crimes, but protection for vulnerable families who had trusted him to seek truth regardless of the personal cost. The community meeting that would determine Millfield's response to the mining company corruption was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in the high school gymnasium. Word had spread throughout the county that Sheriff Harlan would be presenting evidence about Robert Cooper's death and the systematic cover-up that had followed. Tom arrived early to find the gymnasium filling with miners, their families, business owners, and community members who had heard rumors about corporate misconduct but had never seen official documentation. The mining company ledger that contained evidence of systematic safety violations and fraudulent reporting sat in a manila folder on the table where Tom would present his findings. Mayor Patricia Wells opened the meeting with a nervous acknowledgement that serious questions had been raised about the circumstances surrounding Robert Cooper's death and the community's response to his family's subsequent crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sheriff Harlan has requested this meeting to present information that may change our understanding of events that occurred at the Millfield copper mine nearly a year ago. Patricia announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that her trusting corporate assurances had been manipulated. Tom stood before the crowd with the evidence that represented months of investigation and the testimony of witnesses who had risked their economic security to come forward with the truth. The gymnasium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the bleachers normally reserved for basketball games. Folks, what I'm about to share with you is difficult to hear, but it's information that every member of this community deserves to know. Tom began, his voice carrying the authority that came from absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause. Tom presented James Stevens' testimony about safety violations, management pressure to ignore protocols, and Robert Cooper's efforts to document dangerous conditions before his death. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Tom described how evidence had been destroyed, witnesses intimidated, and official investigations manipulated. Robert Cooper died trying to protect his co-workers from preventable accidents, Tom continued, holding up the mining company ledger that documented systematic safety violations. After his death, company officials orchestrated a cover-up designed to avoid legal responsibility and continue unsafe operations. The revelation that Robert Cooper's death had been preventable rather than a tragic accident sent a visible shock through the gymnasium. Several former miners stood up to confirm Stevens' account of safety violations and management intimidation, adding their voices to the growing chorus of testimony about corporate misconduct. Bill Brennan, whose family had been feuding with the Walshes over water rights, stood up to address the crowd. "Sheriff, if what you're saying is true, then Robert Cooper was trying to save lives when he died. That makes him a hero, not just an accident victim." Emma Walsh, despite her family's financial crisis, added her support for Tom's investigation. "Sheriff Harlan, this community owes Robert Cooper's family more than sympathy. We owe them justice and the truth about why a good man died trying to protect his friends." Doc Henderson rose from his seat in the front row, his medical bag beside him and his expression carrying decades of regret about remaining silent when he should have spoken truth to power. "Tom is right about everything he's told you tonight," Doc said, his voice carrying throughout the gymnasium. "I treated miners for injuries caused by the same safety violations that killed Robert Cooper. I should have connected those individual cases to a pattern of systematic negligence, but I failed to advocate for my patients the way Robert advocated for his coworkers." The crowd's reaction to Doc Henderson's confession was immediate and emotional. Several families whose loved ones had been injured at the mine called out support for both Doc's honesty and Tom's investigation, creating a groundswell of community support for seeking accountability. Mary Cooper, still recovering from months of untreated illness, but determined to honor her husband's memory, stood with the help of Mrs. Chun to address the community that had unknowingly abandoned her family during their crisis. "Robert died trying to make the mine safer for everyone," Mary said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "If his death can prevent other families from losing their fathers, then his sacrifice will have meaning. But that can only happen if this community demands accountability from the people who caused his death." The emotional impact of Mary Cooper's words was amplified by the presence of Emma Cooper, who sat in the front row holding baby Johnny and representing the family that had suffered because institutional systems had failed to provide support during their crisis. Frank Morrison stood to announce that his general store would donate supplies for any families affected by potential mining company retaliation. If corporate lawyers think they can intimidate this community into silence, they don't understand what kind of people live in Millfield. The meeting concluded with unanimous community support for Tom's investigation and a formal resolution demanding that state and federal authorities pursue criminal charges against mining company executives and any local officials who had participated in the cover-up. The aftermath of the community meeting brought swift action from state and federal authorities. who had been building cases against mining companies throughout the region. Within 48 hours, FBI agents arrived in Millfield to coordinate with Tom's investigation and begin formal criminal proceedings against mining company executives. Agent Sarah Mitchell, a federal prosecutor specializing in corporate crimes, met with Tom to review the evidence and coordinate arrests that would take place simultaneously at mining operations in 3 states. Sheriff Harlan, your investigation has provided crucial documentation for a case that extends far beyond Millfield, Agent Mitchell explained. The mining company executives have been using identical tactics to cover up safety violations and silence workers at facilities throughout the region. Tom learned that Robert Cooper's death was part of a pattern of preventable workplace fatalities that had been systematically concealed through corporate manipulation of regulatory processes. The evidence Tom had gathered would support criminal charges including negligent homicide, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness intimidation. Agent Mitchell, what kind of accountability can we expect for the officials who participated in the cover-up? Sheriff, anyone who knowingly participated in destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses will face federal charges. However, officials who were misled by false corporate information may avoid prosecution if they cooperate with our investigation. The distinction between complicity and manipulation was important for understanding how the cover-up had succeeded in preventing earlier detection of corporate crimes. Local officials like Mayor Wells had been deceived rather than corrupted, making them witnesses rather than defendants in the criminal proceedings. Tom accompanied federal agents to the mining company's regional headquarters, where executives were arrested on charges related to Robert Cooper's death and similar incidents at other facilities. The arrests were coordinated with seizure of corporate records that documented the wanton, systematic nature of safety violations and cover-up efforts. The mining company's attempts to intimidate witnesses and control the narrative collapsed when faced with federal law enforcement resources and community support for Tom's investigation. Corporate lawyers who had previously used economic pressure to silence critics found themselves facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Emma Cooper watched from Mrs. Chen's boarding house as news reports showed mining company executives being led away in handcuffs, finally seeing accountability for the decisions that had caused her father's death and her family's subsequent suffering. Sheriff Tom, will the bad people have to pay for what they did to Daddy? Emma asked with the directness that had characterized all her questions about adult failures and institutional responsibility. Yes, Emma. The people who made dangerous decisions that caused your daddy's death will have to answer for their choices. In court, Tom replied, kneeling down to speak with her at eye level. And your daddy's work to protect other miners will be remembered as something brave and important. The legal proceedings moved quickly once federal authorities became involved. The mining company executives pled guilty to criminal charges in exchange for cooperation with broader investigations into industry practices. Their testimony revealed the systematic nature of safety violations and cover-up efforts that had endangered workers throughout the region. Mary Cooper received notification that she would be eligible for substantial compensation through both criminal restitution and civil litigation against the mining company. The financial settlement would ensure that her family's basic needs were met while she completed her recovery and established long-term stability. More importantly for the community, the mining company agreed to implement comprehensive safety reforms and submit to ongoing federal oversight of their operations. The changes would be named the Robert Cooper Safety Protocols, in recognition of his efforts to protect worker welfare. Doc Henderson announced his intention to establish a free medical clinic, funded through his own resources and community donations. The clinic would ensure that families like the Coopers would never again go without medical care due to financial barriers. This community failed the Cooper family when they needed help most, Doc said during the announcement ceremony. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again. Mayor Patricia Wells was re-elected on a platform of government transparency and community support for vulnerable families. Her experience with the mining company deception had transformed her approach to municipal leadership, emphasizing accountability and citizen involvement in all major decisions. The Brennan and Walsh families resolved their water dispute through a cooperative agreement that recognized their shared challenges rather than treating each other as enemies. The resolution became a model for addressing resource conflicts through collaboration rather than competition. Frank Morrison's General Store became the center for a community support network that provided emergency assistance to families facing temporary crises. The system prevented the kind of hidden suffering that had characterized the Cooper family's experience while maintaining dignity. Through mutual aid rather than charity, Mrs. Chun's boarding house was officially designated as the community's Family Crisis Center, with county funding to support her work providing emergency shelter and coordinating assistance for families in transition. Tom's investigation had transformed Millfield from a community divided by suspicion and competition into a place where neighbors actively looked out for each other's welfare, creating the kind of mutual support that could prevent future tragedies through early intervention and shared responsibility. 6 months after the mining company executives were sentenced to federal prison, Millfield had transformed into the kind of community that Sarah Harlan had always envisioned, a place where neighbors actively supported each other through difficult times and where institutional accountability ensured that vulnerable families received protection rather than abandonment. Tom stood in his office on a bright spring morning, studying the wall where Sarah's wedding ring now hung in a simple frame beside the original town charter. The ring had become a symbol of enduring love and the values that guided communities through both tragedy and triumph. The charter's promises of mutual aid and shared responsibility were no longer bitter reminders of failed ideals, but inspiration for the ongoing work of building sustainable support systems. Emma Cooper burst through the office door with the exuberant energy of a 9-year-old who had rediscovered the security of childhood after months of carrying adult responsibilities. She was holding a hand-carved wooden star that she had been working on during her woodcarving lessons with Walter Walsh, who had become her unofficial grandfather and mentor. "Sheriff Tom, I finished your present," Emma announced, offering the wooden star with pride that reflected both her artistic achievement and her gratitude for everything Tom had done for her family. Tom accepted the star with the reverence appropriate for a gift that represented far more than simple craftsmanship. The star had been carved from wood taken from the cottonwood tree beside the abandoned farmhouse where Emma's family had suffered in silence, transformed through patient work into something beautiful and enduring. "Emma, this is the most beautiful star I've ever seen," Tom said, examining the careful details that showed Emma's growing skill and artistic vision. "Where should we display it so everyone can appreciate your work?" "Right here on your desk, so you can remember that even when things seem dark, there are always people who care enough to help," Emma replied with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about fundamental truths that adults struggle to understand. Tom placed the wooden star on his desk, beside photographs of the Cooper family's recovery and the community support networks that had emerged from their crisis. The star would serve as a daily reminder that individual acts of compassion could create ripple effects that transformed entire communities. Mary Cooper appeared in the office doorway, carrying baby Johnny, who had grown into a healthy, laughing toddler whose development showed no signs of the malnutrition that had marked his early months. Mary herself had recovered completely from the infections and health problems that had nearly cost her life, and she now worked as a coordinator for the Community Family Support Center. "Tom, I wanted to thank you again for believing in our family when we had stopped believing in ourselves," Mary said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the confidence of someone who had rebuilt her life through community support. and personal determination. Mary, your family's courage in sharing your story is what made all the difference, Tom replied. Emma's trust and your willingness to let the community help are what transformed this situation from a hidden tragedy into an opportunity for positive change. The annual memorial service for mining accident victims had become a community tradition that honored both Robert Cooper's memory and the ongoing commitment to worker safety that had emerged from his death. The service was held at the site where a memorial garden had been planted, featuring trees donated by families throughout the region and maintained by volunteers who understood the importance of remembering sacrifices made for community welfare. Tom delivered remarks at the memorial service that emphasized the connection between individual tragedy and collective responsibility. Robert Cooper died trying to protect his co-workers from preventable accidents. His death could have remained a forgotten tragedy, but this community chose to transform his sacrifice into lasting improvements in worker safety and family support. Emma Cooper laid flowers at the memorial stone that bore her father's name alongside the names of other workers who had died due to preventable industrial accidents. The inscription read, "They died protecting others. We live to honor their sacrifice." Mrs. Chun had expanded her boarding house into a comprehensive family resource center that provided emergency shelter, job training, childcare, and the kind of dignity-preserving mutual aid that allowed people to contribute while receiving assistance. The center served as a model for communities throughout the region that were developing their own support networks. Sheriff Tom, this community has learned that taking care of everyone makes everyone stronger, Mrs. Chun observed as they watched Emma Cooper playing with other children whose families had found stability through community support. When people help each other, nobody has to suffer alone. The transformation extended beyond individual families to include institutional changes that addressed the systematic problems that had allowed the Cooper family's crisis to remain hidden. The county had established mandatory family welfare assessments. The state had strengthened mining safety regulations, and federal authorities continued monitoring corporate compliance with worker protection standards. Tom's investigation had created a legacy that extended far beyond Millfield, influencing mining safety policies and community support systems throughout the region. Other communities had adopted similar mutual aid networks, and federal legislation, named the Robert Cooper Worker Protection Act, had strengthened safety enforcement and whistleblower protections nationwide. As evening approached, Tom walked his familiar patrol through downtown Millfield, noting the occupied storefronts that had replaced empty buildings, the families gathering for dinner in homes that were no longer threatened by foreclosure, and the children playing in streets where hope had replaced despair. At the cemetery where Sarah was buried, Tom found fresh flowers that Emma Cooper had placed beside the headstone, a weekly tradition that honored the woman whose journal had provided guidance during the community's darkest period. Sarah, Emma wanted you to know that the community you dreamed about is becoming real, Tom said quietly, addressing the marker that represented both personal loss and enduring inspiration. Families are looking out for each other. Institutions are protecting vulnerable people, and children like Emma are growing up knowing that adults will keep them safe. The wooden star that Emma had carved sat on Tom's desk as a permanent reminder that even the darkest situations could be transformed through compassion, courage, and the willingness to seek truth regardless of the personal cost. Robert Cooper's death had been a tragedy, but his legacy lived on in a community that had learned to protect its most vulnerable members through shared responsibility and mutual care. Tom's badge no longer felt like a burden of managing decline, but a symbol of the ongoing work required to maintain communities where families could thrive and children could trust that adults would protect them from preventable harm. Emma Cooper's simple words had been prophetic. Even when things seemed dark, there were always people who cared enough to help.